On a crisp autumn morning, the kind where the air feels fresh and full of possibilities, Mrs. Chen rushed around her cozy suburban kitchen, trying to juggle multiple tasks at once. The smell of slightly burnt toast filled the air as she quickly scraped the darkened edges into the sink. Her phone buzzed constantly with work emails, each one seemingly more urgent than the last. "Sweetie, your breakfast is ready," she called out, while simultaneously typing a quick response to her boss about the upcoming presentation. The sound of small feet padding down the stairs brought a smile to her face despite her chaotic morning. Little Emmy appeared in the doorway, her dark hair still messy from sleep, clutching her beloved stuffed elephant that had seen better days. She was already dressed in her favorite outfit, purple leggings and a rainbow sweater that didn't quite match, but she had insisted on picking her own clothes this year. After all, first grade was a big deal. "Mom, can I have strawberry jam today?" Emmy asked, climbing onto her usual spot at the kitchen counter. She swung her legs back and forth, her tiny feet not quite reaching the floor. "And can you make the toast smile like you used to?" Mrs. Chen paused her email typing, looking at her daughter's hopeful expression. Work could wait a few minutes. She grabbed a new slice of bread and popped it in the toaster, then reached for the strawberry jam in the fridge. These small moments mattered more than any urgent email. "Did you pack your homework?" she asked, arranging the jam in a curved smile on the fresh piece of toast. "Mrs. Baker said you have that special science project due today, right?" Emmy's eyes widened. "Oh no, I forgot to put it in my bag." She jumped down from her chair and ran back upstairs, her half-eaten breakfast forgotten in her panic. Mrs. Chen couldn't help but chuckle. Their morning routine had been the same for the past 3 years, ever since they'd moved to Meadowbrook Lane after the divorce. The neighborhood had seemed perfect, quiet streets, good schools, and most importantly, a fresh start for both of them. Looking out the kitchen window, she could see their neighbors starting their own morning routines. Mr. Williams next door was retrieving his newspaper in his usual plaid robe. The new family across the street was loading their kids into their minivan. They had moved in about 6 months ago, but Mrs. Chen realized she barely knew them beyond the occasional wave. Life had become so busy lately, between her promotion at work and Amy's growing list of after-school activities. "Found it," Emmy announced triumphantly, returning with a colorful poster board covered in pictures of different types of clouds. She carefully slid it into her oversized purple backpack, the one with unicorn patches that she had begged for at the start of the school year. Mrs. Chen glanced at the clock. 7:45 a.m. "Okay, sweetie, time to head to the bus stop. Do you have everything? Homework? Lunch? Your library book?" Emmy nodded at each item, patting her backpack confidently. "And I have my special lucky pencil for the spelling test." "That's my organized girl," Mrs. Chen said proudly, helping Emmy adjust her backpack straps. She bent down to give her daughter a quick hug and kiss. "Remember, just like always, wait at the bus stop with the other kids. Mrs. Rivera's twins should be there too." "I know, Mom," Emmy said with the slight exasperation that only a 6-year-old could muster. "I'm not a baby anymore." The morning sun streamed through the kitchen windows as Amy headed toward the front door. She paused to pet their elderly cat, Mittens, who was sunbathing in his favorite spot by the door. "Love you, Mom," Amy called out, waving as she stepped outside. "Love you too, sweetheart. Have a great day." Mrs. Chen watched from the doorway as her daughter skipped down their front path, her purple backpack bouncing with each step. The bus stop was just 2 houses down, a journey Emmy had made countless times before. Other neighborhood children were already gathering at the corner, their excited chatter carrying on the morning breeze. Mrs. Chen smiled, remembering how nervous Emmy had been on her first day of school, clutching her hand and refusing to let go. Now here she was, confidently making her way on her own. Back in the kitchen, Mrs. Chen began cleaning up the breakfast dishes, her mind already shifting to her upcoming work meetings. The morning news played quietly on the small kitchen TV, providing background noise as she loaded the dishwasher. A story about the local farmers market caught her attention. She made a mental note to take Emmy there over the weekend. They could pick up fresh apples for baking, one of their favorite mother-daughter activities. She was just about to head upstairs to get ready for work when her phone rang. The school's number flashed on the screen. Her heart skipped a beat. The school never called this early unless something was wrong. "Hello," she answered, trying to keep her voice steady. "Mrs. Chen, this is Ms. Thompson from the front office at Meadowbrook Elementary." The rest of the world seemed to fade away as she listened to the words that would shepherd her ordinary morning. Amy had never arrived at school. Looking back later, Mrs. Chen would remember every detail of that moment, the half-washed coffee mug still in her hand, the cat stretching lazily in his sunbeam, the cheerful weather forecast playing on the TV. It was amazing how quickly a perfectly normal morning could transform into your worst nightmare. But in that moment, standing in her kitchen with her phone pressed to her ear, she had no way of knowing that this terrifying day would end up changing not just her life, but her entire perspective on community, prejudice, and the unexpected ways that love and kindness can appear in our lives. She had no way of knowing that sometimes the most beautiful stories can emerge from our darkest moments, or that the neighbors she had barely spoken to would soon become an integral part of her family's story. All she knew was that her little girl, her brave, independent first grader who insisted on picking out her own mismatched clothes and still wanted smiley faces on her toast, was missing. And in that heart-stopping moment, nothing else in the world mattered. Mrs. Chen's hands trembled as she put down the phone. For a moment, she stood frozen in her kitchen, her mind refusing to process what she'd just heard. The ticking of the wall clock seemed deafening in the sudden silence. Then, like a rubber band snapping, she burst into action. "Amy," she screamed, running toward the front door. She didn't even stop to grab her coat, despite the autumn chill. The screen door slammed behind her as she sprinted down the front path, her slippers barely staying on her feet. "Amy?" Her voice echoed down the quiet suburban street. A few early morning dog walkers turned to stare, but she didn't care. Her eyes desperately scanned the path to the bus stop, looking for any sign of her daughter's purple backpack or rainbow sweater. The bus stop stood empty now, the morning rush of children long gone. Mrs. Chen's heart pounded as she ran the short distance, searching for any clue. A discarded candy wrapper, a fallen leaf, anything that might tell her where her little girl had gone. "Mrs. Rivera," she called out, spotting her neighbor getting into her car. "Did you see Amy at the bus stop with your twins this morning?" The other mother's face creased with concern. "No, I didn't. The boys said they didn't see her either. Is everything okay?" The words stuck in Mrs. Chen's throat. Saying them out loud would make this nightmare real. She never made it to school. Mrs. Rivera's hand flew to her mouth. "Oh my God. Let me help you look. Boys," she called to her twins, who were playing in the front yard. "Come help us find Amy." Mrs. Chen's phone felt heavy in her hand as she dialed 911. Her voice shook as she reported her missing daughter. The operator's calm questions felt like torture. "How tall is she? What was she wearing? Any distinguishing marks or features? When was she last seen?" 6 years old, purple backpack, rainbow sweater, missing front tooth. Each detail felt like a knife to her heart. This couldn't be happening. Not in their safe little neighborhood. Not to her careful, sensible little girl. More neighbors emerged from their houses, drawn by the commotion. Mrs. Chen barely registered their presence as she paced back and forth along the street, her eyes scanning every bush, every shadow. Her mind raced with terrible possibilities. Had someone taken her? Had she wandered off? Was she hurt somewhere, calling for her mommy? "I should have walked with her," she mumbled, tears streaming down her face. "I'd always walk with her. Why didn't I walk with her today?" An elderly neighbor brought her a coat, draping it gently over her shoulders. Someone else pressed a bottle of water into her hands. But these kind gestures felt distant, unreal. The only reality was the growing void where her daughter should be. The sound of a car engine made her head snap up. Could it be Amy? But it was just the school bus driver who had turned around on his route after hearing the news. "I never saw her this morning," he said, his face pale with worry. "I always wave to her. She's usually one of the first ones on, sitting right behind me with her little elephant." Mrs. Chen's knees buckled at the mention of the stuffed elephant. It was still sitting on Amy's bed, forgotten in the rush to find her science project. Amy never went anywhere without that elephant. If she'd left it behind, she must have been planning to come right back. The wail of police sirens cut through the morning air. 2 patrol cars pulled up, their lights flashing against the neat suburban houses. Officers stepped out, their faces serious but kind. Mrs. Chen, one officer approached her. "I'm Officer Lee. We're going to find your daughter." He spoke with quiet confidence, but Mrs. Chen could see the tension in his jaw. Every minute that passed made the situation more serious. The neighborhood had transformed into a scene from her worst nightmares. Police radios crackled. Neighbors huddled in groups, pointing and discussing where to search. Someone had already printed flyers with Amy's school picture, passing them out to the growing crowd of volunteers. She just learned to tie her shoes. Mrs. Chen found herself telling Officer Lee, the random detail bubbling up through her panic. "She's been practicing every morning. She was so proud." The officer nodded, jotting notes in his little book. "That's good. That's very helpful. Every detail helps. Now, has Amy ever wandered off before?" Mrs. Chen shook her head vigorously. "Never. She's such a responsible girl. She always follows the rules. Her voice broke. She just wanted to show me she could walk to the bus stop by herself." A commotion near the end of the street caught their attention. The new neighbors from across the street were heading out with what looked like professional search gear, flashlights, walkie-talkies, even a first aid kit. "We used to work with the city parks department," the wife explained quickly. "We know how to organize a proper search. We'll take the wooded area behind the houses." Officer Lee nodded approvingly. "Good thinking. We'll coordinate with you." "Mrs. Chen, is there anywhere special Amy likes to go? Any secret spots she's mentioned?" Mrs. Chen racked her brain, trying to think through the fog of panic. She loves animals. She's always trying to rescue strays. Last week, she spent an hour trying to help a butterfly with a torn wing. More police cars arrived. A news van pulled up at the end of the street. The morning sun climbed higher in the sky, marking the passage of precious minutes. Each second that ticked by felt like an eternity to Mrs. Chen. She couldn't stop herself from checking her phone every few seconds, even though she knew it hadn't rung. The screen showed her last text from the night before. Amy's blurry attempt at photographing the moon from her bedroom window. "Please," she whispered, clutching the phone to her chest. "Please let her be okay. Please let me find my baby." The autumn breeze carried the sound of people calling Amy's name from all directions. But there was no answer, no cheerful voice calling back. No sound of running feet or giggles or any of the 100 little noises that usually announced her daughter's presence. Just silence and the growing weight of fear in Mrs. Chen's heart. The whole neighborhood had come alive in a way Mrs. Chen had never seen before. People she only ever nodded to at the mailbox were now organizing search parties, marking off areas on hastily drawn maps spread across car hoods. The morning sun had burned away the early fog, but the worry in everyone's hearts only grew thicker. "We'll take the creek area," called out the tall man from across the street, gathering a group of volunteers. His wife stood beside him, handing out bright orange safety vests from their garage. Mrs. Chen had always meant to introduce herself when they'd first moved in, but somehow there had never seemed to be the right moment. Now, watching them coordinate the search with practiced ease, she felt a wave of gratitude mixed with regret. "I brought water and snacks for the search teams," announced Mrs. Baker from 2 doors down, carrying a large cooler. Her teenage sons followed with more supplies. "And I've got my first aid kit, just in case." The just in case hung heavy in the air, but no one spoke the fears out loud. Officer Lee had set up a command center in front of Mrs. Chen's house. His radio crackled constantly with updates from other officers and search teams. "The school's sending out an alert to all parents," he informed Mrs. Chen. "And we've got officers checking every street within a 5-mile radius." Mrs. Chen stood in her driveway, feeling helpless as people bustled around her. Her phone kept buzzing with messages from concerned parents in Amy's class. Each notification made her heart jump, hoping it might be news about her daughter, only to crash again when it wasn't. The new neighbors from across the street approached her. Up close, she could see the determination in their eyes. "I'm Mrs. Thomas," the wife said gently, "and this is my husband. We used to coordinate search and rescue operations before we moved here. We're going to find your little girl." "Did Amy ever mention any special places she likes to explore?" Mr. Thomas asked, his voice calm and professional. "Kids often have hiding spots they think adults don't know about." Mrs. Chen wiped her tears with shaking hands. She loves watching the birds in the wooded area behind our houses. but I've always told her never to go there alone. She promised she wouldn't. Kids sometimes break promises when they see something interesting, Mrs. Thomas said kindly. Especially if they think they'll be quick and no one will notice. Let's focus on that area. More neighbors arrived, some still in pajamas or work clothes, all ready to help. Mrs. Rivera had printed dozens of flyers with Amy's picture, and teams were already spreading out to post them around the neighborhood and beyond. I called my sister in the next town, one neighbor announced. She's spreading the word through their community Facebook group. The whole county will be looking for Amy soon. The local news crew had set up their equipment, and a young reporter approached Mrs. Chen. Officer Lee stepped in protectively. Mrs. Chen, you don't have to speak to them if you don't want to. But sometimes media coverage can help get the word out faster. Mrs. Chen nodded numbly. She'd seen missing children reports on the news before, always thinking how terrible it must be for those parents. Now here she was, living that same nightmare. I'll talk to them. Anything that might help find her. The reporter was surprisingly gentle, helping Mrs. Chen straighten her collar and wiping away a smudge of breakfast jam she hadn't realized was still on her cheek. These small acts of kindness nearly broke her composure completely. Just speak from your heart, the reporter advised. Tell us about Amy, what she was wearing, where she was last seen. Someone out there might have seen something important. As Mrs. Chen described her daughter to the camera, the rainbow sweater, the purple backpack, the missing front tooth, she was struck by how many details suddenly seemed crucial. The way Amy skipped every third step when she was happy. How she always stopped to look at caterpillars. The little tune she hummed when she was thinking hard about something. Behind the news crew, the search was expanding. Mr. Thomas had divided the volunteers into groups, each with a designated area to search. Some people brought their dogs to help, and the air was filled with whistles and calling voices. I remember when she first rode her bike down this street, said old Mr. Wilson, who usually complained about neighborhood noise. Now he was passing out spare flashlights from his garage. She was wobbly as anything, but she kept trying. Determined little thing. The memory hit Mrs. Chen hard. Amy practicing for hours, refusing to give up even after skinning both knees. She'd finally succeeded right in front of Mr. Wilson's house, and he'd clapped and given her a peppermint candy from his pocket. Mrs. Thomas returned from a quick survey of the wood's edge. We've got good visibility today, and the ground's still a bit damp from yesterday's rain. That means we might find footprints. We're going to do this systematically, every inch. A young couple Mrs. Chen had never seen before approached with several bags of sandwiches. We heard about it on the local Facebook group, they explained. We live a few streets over. Our daughter is in first grade too. We had to come help. The community's response was overwhelming. People from all walks of life, many of whom had never spoken to each other before, were working together with single-minded purpose. Race, age, social status, none of it mattered. They were united by one goal, finding a little girl in a rainbow sweater who should have been safely at school learning about clouds. It's amazing, isn't it? Mrs. Rivera said softly, standing beside Mrs. Chen. How something like this shows you who people really are. Mrs. Chen looked around at her neighborhood, really looked at it for the first time in years. The retired teacher testing his old whistle. The quiet accountant who worked from home, now making phone calls to everyone he knew. The new family she'd been too busy to welcome properly, leading the search with professional skill and genuine care. They weren't just houses and streets anymore. They were people, real people with hearts and lives and a shared humanity that transcended all differences. It took her daughter going missing to finally see it clearly. We're going to find her, Mrs. Thomas said firmly, returning with more search gear. Every person here is another pair of eyes, another set of hands. We're not giving up until we bring your girl home. Mrs. Chen nodded, tears flowing freely now. In the midst of her worst nightmare, she had discovered something unexpected. She wasn't alone. Not even close. The search had been going on for nearly 2 hours when Mrs. Thomas made a crucial observation. She had been studying the worn paths behind the houses, where years of children's feet had created tiny trails through the undergrowth. Most of the adult searchers had overlooked these smaller paths, focusing instead on the wider, more obvious routes. Wait, she called out, crouching down to examine something in the dewy grass. Everyone, hold your positions for a moment. Her voice carried the authority of years of search and rescue experience, and the volunteers immediately stopped moving. Mrs. Chen rushed over, her heart pounding. "Did you find something?" Mrs. Thomas pointed to what looked like a scuff mark in the mud. Next to it was a small impression that could have been made by a child's shoe. "Look at how the grass is bent here," she explained, gesturing to a barely visible trail leading into the denser part of the woods. "And see these broken spider webs? Something, or someone, passed through here recently." Mr. Thomas joined them, pulling out his map. "This isn't one of the main paths we've been searching. It's smaller, easier to miss if you're not looking for it." He studied the direction of the bent grass. "It leads toward the creek area." Mrs. Chen felt her throat tighten. "Annie loves watching the creek. She's always begging me to let her go look for tadpoles, but I never." Her voice broke. "I always said it was too dangerous without an adult." Officer Lee quickly organized the nearby search teams. "We'll need to move carefully," he instructed. "If there are any signs of passage, we don't want to disturb them. And if she is down there, we don't want to frighten her." Mrs. Thomas took charge of the creek search, her experience showing in every decisive move. "We'll form a line," she explained, positioning the volunteers. "Each person stay within sight of the people on either side. Look for anything unusual, disturbed leaves, broken twigs, pieces of clothing caught on branches." The path was so narrow that adults had to walk sideways in some spots. Mrs. Chen realized with a pang that it was just the right size for a small child to navigate easily. How many times had Amy looked at this path, planning her adventure? "I found something," called one of the volunteers. Everyone froze. The man carefully picked up a small hair tie with rainbow beads, one of Amy's favorites. Mrs. Chen's knees went weak. That's hers. She was wearing it this morning. The discovery energized the search team. They moved forward with renewed purpose, following the tiny trail as it wound deeper into the woods. The sounds of the neighborhood grew fainter, replaced by the rustle of leaves and the distant sound of running water. "The creek's getting closer," Mr. Thomas noted, checking his GPS. "The ravine gets steeper here. We need to be careful." Mrs. Chen hadn't even known there was a ravine behind their neighborhood. How has she lived here for 3 years without exploring this area? She'd been so busy with work, with keeping their life running smoothly after the divorce, that she'd missed seeing the world through her daughter's eyes. The ground began to slope downward, and the vegetation grew thicker. Brambles caught at their clothes, and the earth was slick with morning dew. Several volunteers slipped, catching themselves on tree trunks. "This would be quite an adventure for a child," Mrs. Thomas said softly, helping Mrs. Chen navigate a particularly tricky section, "especially one who loves nature like your Amy." They could hear the creek more clearly now, its gentle burble mixing with the sound of birds and rustling leaves. It was beautiful in a wild sort of way, but all Mrs. Chen could think about was her little girl possibly lost in this maze of green. "Look at this," Mrs. Thomas suddenly called out, her trained eye catching something the others had missed. She pointed to a small opening between 2 large bushes. The branches were bent in an unusual way, and there were fresh scrapes in the bark. "It's like a little doorway," one of the volunteers observed, "just the right size for a child." Mrs. Chen's heart leaped. This was exactly the kind of magical-looking entrance that would appeal to her daughter's imagination. Amy was always finding secret gardens and fairy doors in ordinary places. The team carefully made their way closer to the hidden entrance. The sound of the creek was very loud now, and they could feel the coolness of the water in the air. Mrs. Thomas pulled out her flashlight, shining it through the opening. "There's a clearer space on the other side," she reported. And, wait, she adjusted her light, focusing on something in the distance. "I think I see more footprints." The excitement was palpable, but everyone maintained their professional calm. They'd all heard stories of search and rescue operations where enthusiasm led to crucial evidence being destroyed. "Mrs. Chen," Officer Lee said quietly, "we're going to need you to stay calm, no matter what we find. Can you do that?" She nodded, though her whole body was trembling. The waiting was torture, but she understood the need for care and patience. Still, every fiber of her being wanted to push through that opening and run calling her daughter's name. Mrs. Thomas carefully began clearing a safer path through the bushes, her movements precise and deliberate. "The ground's pretty muddy through here," she noted, perfect for preserving tracks. As they worked, the morning sun finally reached this hidden corner of the woods. The light filtered through the leaves, creating dappled patterns on the ground. Under different circumstances, it would have been magical. "I've got definite footprints," Mrs. Thomas announced, her voice taut with controlled excitement. "Small ones, leading toward the creek bank. They're fresh. The edges are still sharp." Mrs. Chen pressed her hands to her mouth, trying to hold back a sob. These were real signs, actual proof that Amy had passed this way. For the first time since that terrible phone call, she felt a spark of hope. The hidden path was revealing itself, one careful step at a time. And somewhere at the end of it, perhaps, was a little girl in a rainbow sweater, waiting to be found. The creek came into view through the trees, sunlight dancing on its surface. Mrs. Thomas led the way, moving with the careful precision of someone who had done this many times before. The muddy bank was covered in a mess of footprints now, but she focused on the smallest ones, the ones that could only belong to a child. "The prints lead downstream," she said quietly, keeping her voice steady despite the growing excitement. "See how they weave back and forth, like someone was exploring." Mrs. Chen could picture it so clearly, her curious little girl, distracted by every interesting leaf and stone, wandering further and further from the path she knew. Amy had always been drawn to anything that sparkled or moved, especially if it was alive. The search team spread out along the bank, everyone moving with deliberate care. The creek wasn't deep, but the water moved quickly enough to make tiny rapids over the stones. The sound of it filled the air, along with bird calls and the rustling of leaves in the breeze. "There's something ahead," Mr. Thomas called out softly, pointing to a bend in the creek where fallen trees had created a natural bridge. "Looks like a sheltered spot." Mrs. Chen's heart nearly stopped when she saw a flash of purple behind the logs. Could it be Emmy's backpack? She started forward, but Officer Lee gently held her back. "Let Mrs. Thomas check first," he whispered. "We don't want to startle her if she's there." Mrs. Thomas crept closer to the fallen trees, her movements slow and non-threatening. She peered around the natural barrier, then suddenly straightened up. Her face broke into a wide smile. "Well, hello there," she said warmly, as if finding lost children was an everyday occurrence. "You must be Emmy. We've been looking everywhere for you." A small voice piped up from behind the logs. "I'm trying to help the baby bunny. He's hurt." Mrs. Chen's knees went weak at the sound of her daughter's voice. She would have fallen if Officer Lee hadn't caught her arm. Annie was alive. Annie was safe. And he was helping a bunny? Mrs. Thomas kept her voice calm and friendly. "Can I come see the bunny? I used to help hurt animals all the time in my old job." "Okay," Annie agreed. "But be quiet. He's scared." The search team watched as Mrs. Thomas carefully made her way around the fallen trees. From their position, they could now see Amy clearly, her rainbow sweater muddy but intact, her purple backpack propped against a log, and in her lap, a tiny brown rabbit. "Sweetheart," Mrs. Thomas said gently, crouching down beside her, "your mom's very worried about you. She's been looking for you all morning." Annie's eyes widened. "Mom's here." She looked around anxiously. "Is she mad?" "I'm here, baby." Mrs. Chen couldn't hold back any longer. She rushed forward, scrambling over the slippery rocks, not caring that she was getting soaked. "I'm not mad. I'm just so happy to find you." Annie carefully set the bunny down in a soft nest of leaves she'd made. "I saw him limping when I was walking to the bus," she explained, her lower lip trembling. "He looked so lonely and scared. I thought I could help him really quick and still get to school, but then I couldn't find my way back." Mrs. Chen gathered her daughter into her arms, not caring about the mud that was getting all over both of them. Amy's hair smelled like leaves and creek water, and her hands were cold, but she was whole and safe and here. "I'm sorry, Mom," Annie whispered, burying her face in her mother's neck. "I know I'm not supposed to go in the woods alone, but the bunny needed help." Mrs. Thomas knelt beside them, examining the small rabbit. "You did a very kind thing wanting to help," she said, "but you scared a lot of people who care about you. Next time you see an animal that needs help, what should you do?" Emmy sniffled. "Tell a grown-up." "That's right," Mrs. Thomas smiled. "And you know what? This little guy doesn't look too badly hurt. Probably just a sore paw. We can call the Wildlife Rescue Center to check on him." The rest of the search team had gathered around, everyone wearing expressions of relief and joy. Officer Lee was already radioing back to the command center. "We found her. She's safe. Everyone can stand down." "You won't believe how many people have been looking for you," Mrs. Chen told her daughter, still holding her tight. "The whole neighborhood came together to help find you." Amy's eyes grew round. "Even Mr. Wilson. He always says kids are too noisy." "Even Mr. Wilson," Mrs. Chen laughed through her tears. "He gave out all his flashlights to help people search." The little rabbit watched them from its leaf nest, nose twitching. Mrs. Thomas carefully picked it up, cradling it gently. "Why don't we all head back? I know some people who can help this little one, and I think there are a lot of neighbors who'd love to see you safe and sound, Amy." As they prepared to leave the creek bank, Mrs. Chen noticed something remarkable. The morning sun had reached the perfect angle to create dozens of tiny rainbows in the creek's spray. Amy noticed them too, pointing in wonder. "Look, Mom, they match my sweater." Mrs. Chen hugged her daughter close again, thinking about how this spot, which had been the source of such fear and worry just moments ago, could also hold such beauty. Rather like the day itself, which had started in terror but was transforming into something unexpectedly wonderful. "Ready to go home?" she asked softly. Amy nodded, then looked back at the rabbit in Mrs. Thomas's careful hands. "Can we make sure that Bunny gets home too?" "Yes, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen promised. "Everyone's going to get home safe today." The walk back through the woods felt completely different from the frantic search earlier. The morning sun streamed through the leaves, creating patches of warm light on the path. Amy held her mother's hand tightly, occasionally looking back to check on the baby rabbit in Mrs. Thomas's gentle care. "Everyone was super worried about you," Officer Lee explained to Amy as they walked. "Even the TV news people came to help find you." Amy's eyes widened. "I'm going to be on TV." She looked down at her mud-covered rainbow sweater and giggled. "I'm all messy." "You look perfect," Mrs. Chen said, squeezing her daughter's hand. She'd never seen anything more beautiful than her little girl's muddy face and tangled hair. As they approached the edge of the woods, they could hear voices calling back and forth. "They found her. She's okay. They're coming back." The sight that greeted them at the tree line was overwhelming. The entire neighborhood had gathered, creating a corridor of smiling, tearful faces. Amy suddenly turned shy, pressing closer to her mother's side. "Look who's back," Mrs. Thomas announced cheerfully, still carefully holding the injured rabbit. The crowd broke into spontaneous applause and cheers. Old Mr. Wilson pushed through the crowd, a tissue clutched in his weathered hand. "There's our brave explorer," he said, his voice gruff with emotion. He pulled a peppermint candy from his pocket, just like he had done when Amy learned to ride her bike. "Thought you might need this after your adventure." Amy accepted the candy with a small smile. "I'm sorry I scared everyone," she said in a tiny voice. "We're just glad you're safe, sweetheart," Mrs. Rivera said, wiping tears from her eyes. Her twins were bouncing with excitement, eager to hear about their friend's adventure. The news crew was filming from a respectful distance, capturing the community's joy without intruding on the intimate moment. Their cameraman was discreetly wiping his eyes between shots. Mrs. Thomas's husband had already called the local wildlife rescue, and they were on their way to help the rabbit. "They said you did a good thing making him a soft nest," he told Amy. "You've got a kind heart, little one." Mrs. Chen watched as her daughter's face lit up at this praise. She realized that while Amy's actions had been frightening for the adults, they had come from a place of pure compassion. How could she be truly angry about that? "Mom," Amy tapped at her sleeve, "can we put up a sign at the bus stop? So if other animals need help, kids know who to tell?" Several neighbors chuckled at this, but Mrs. Thomas nodded seriously. "That's a wonderful idea. Maybe we could even start a neighborhood wildlife watch program. Would you like to help with that?" The crowd began to disperse, but not before several people brought over fresh clothes for both Amy and Mrs. Chen. Someone had even thought to bring Amy's beloved stuffed elephant from her bedroom. The sight of her daughter hugging her favorite toy made Mrs. Chen's eyes fill with tears again. Mrs. Baker, who had been handing out water and snacks all morning, approached with a warm blanket. "I made some hot chocolate too," she said. "Nothing better after a creek adventure." As they settled onto a neighbor's porch steps, wrapped in blankets and sipping hot chocolate, the wildlife rescue arrived. A kind-faced woman examined the rabbit while Amy watched anxiously. "You did a great job looking out for this little guy," the rescue worker praised. "He's got a sprained paw, but he'll be just fine. Would you like to help me give him a name for our records?" Annie thought for a moment, then smiled. "Rainbow, because of all the colors in the creek spray when we found him." The rescue worker promised to send updates about Rainbow's recovery, making Amy beam with pride. Several neighbors quickly offered to help create a proper neighborhood system for reporting injured wildlife, turning a frightening morning into the beginning of something positive. Officer Lee crouched down to Amy's level. "You know, it's good to help others," he said gently, "but it's also important to keep yourself safe. That's why we have a whole community, so we can help each other." Amy nodded solemnly, then looked around at all the faces that had been searching for her. Her small face scrunched up thoughtfully. "I didn't know so many people cared about me." "Oh, sweetheart," Mrs. Chen pulled her daughter close. "So many people care, more than you could ever imagine." The morning's panic was fading into a deeper appreciation of their community. Mrs. Chen looked at her neighbors with new eyes. The family across the street, whose professional skills had been so crucial, the grumpy old man who had shown such tenderness, the countless others who had dropped everything to help find one little girl. The news crew was packing up their equipment, but the reporter paused to speak with Mrs. Chen. "This is the kind of story we love to tell," she said warmly. "Not just about finding a missing child, but about how a community comes together. How people show their true colors in a crisis." Mrs. Thomas sat down beside them, still wrapped in her search gear. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "in all my years of search and rescue, I've learned that it's often the scariest moments that bring out the best in people, that show us who we really are as a community." Amy had fallen asleep against her mother's shoulder, exhausted from her adventure. Her face was peaceful, one hand still clutching her stuffed elephant, the other holding the peppermint candy from Mr. Wilson. The morning sun was high now, warming the autumn air. Neighbors lingered in small groups, reluctant to disperse completely, as if they had discovered something precious in their shared concern and relief, something they didn't want to let go of just yet. Looking at her sleeping daughter, Mrs. Chen realized that while this morning had been one of the scariest of her life, it had also shown her something beautiful about humanity, about community, about the countless threads of caring that connect people who might otherwise remain strangers. Sometimes it takes a child's innocent act of kindness, even a misguided one, to remind adults of their own capacity for compassion. And sometimes it takes getting lost to help everyone find their way back to what really matters. In the weeks that followed Amy's adventure, Meadowbrook Lane transformed in ways nobody could have predicted. What began as a terrifying morning became the catalyst for a community's rebirth. The changes started small, like ripples in a pond, but spread to touch every corner of the neighborhood. The first change appeared at the bus stop. A neat wooden sign now stood there, decorated with children's artwork. "See an injured animal? Tell a grown-up." Below were the contact numbers for local wildlife rescue services and several neighbors who had volunteered to be first responders for animal emergencies. Mrs. Chen smiled every morning when she walked Amy to the bus stop. Yes, she walked with her now, treasuring these few extra minutes together. The sign had been Mr. Wilson's idea, surprisingly enough. He'd built it himself in his garage, letting the neighborhood children paint it with bright colors and animal pictures. "The kids need a proper system," he'd said gruffly while setting up the post. "Can't have them wandering into the woods every time they see a hurt butterfly." But everyone noticed how he'd carved little woodland creatures along the sign's edges, and how he always kept a few peppermint candies in his pocket for his young wildlife spotters. The Thomas family's influence spread beyond their professional search and rescue expertise. They started a monthly community safety workshop, teaching both adults and children about outdoor safety, basic first aid, and what to do in emergencies. Amy sat in the front row at every session, her stuffed elephant clutched tight, soaking up every word. "Remember," Mrs. Thomas would say, "being brave doesn't mean doing things alone. It means knowing when to ask for help." The creek area, once a hidden danger, became a supervised weekend exploration spot. Parents took turns leading small groups of children on nature walks, teaching them about local wildlife while keeping them safe. They called it the Rainbow Trail, named after Amy's rescued rabbit, who had fully recovered at the wildlife center and been released back into the woods. Mrs. Chen found herself hosting weekly dinner gatherings, something she would never have imagined doing before. It started when the Thomas family invited them over to share updates about Rainbow's recovery. Somehow, it grew into a rotating neighborhood tradition, with different families hosting each week. It's funny, Mrs. Rivera said one evening as they all sat in Mrs. Chen's backyard, watching the children play. "We lived next to each other for years, but it took this scare to make us really see each other." The children had formed their own little wildlife watch group, with Amy as their enthusiastic leader. They kept careful logs of animal sightings and made sure any injured creatures were reported to the proper adults. Their dedicated responsibility made everyone smile. "Look what I found." Amy would often call out, but now she always brought her discoveries to show a grown-up first. Her curiosity hadn't diminished, it had just grown wiser. The news story about Amy's rescue had unexpected ripples too. Other communities reached out, wanting to set up similar neighborhood watch programs and wildlife response systems. Mrs. Thomas found herself giving presentations at nearby schools about community safety and the importance of looking out for each other. Even the local police department noticed the change. Officer Lee mentioned during one of his regular neighborhood visits that emergency response times had improved because neighbors now knew exactly who to call and what to do in various situations. They worked like a well-oiled machine, he said, something rare in his experience. One crisp autumn morning, almost exactly a month after Amy's adventure, Mrs. Chen stood at her kitchen window, sipping her coffee. The view was the same: Mr. Wilson getting his newspaper, children gathering at the bus stop, the Thomas family heading out for their morning walk. But everything felt different. She watched Amy carefully pack her backpack for school, making sure her homework was secure. The little girl had grown somehow, not in size but in understanding. She still wore mismatched clothes and loved animals with all her heart, but there was a new awareness in her eyes. "Mom," Amy said, adjusting her rainbow sweater, she still refused to wear any other one. "Can we check on the baby birds in Mrs. Rivera's garden before the bus comes? We have time if we leave now." Mrs. Chen smiled, gathering her keys. "Of course we can, sweetheart. Let's tell Mrs. Rivera we're coming to look, okay?" As they walked down the street, neighbors called out morning greetings. Each familiar face reminded Mrs. Chen of that frightening day. How they had all dropped everything to search for one little girl, how differences had melted away in the face of what really mattered. The experience had taught them all something valuable. It wasn't just about keeping children safe or helping injured animals. It was about the power of community, the importance of really seeing the people around you, and how the simple act of caring could transform a street of strangers into a family. "You know what, Mom?" Amy said, slipping her small hand into her mother's as they walked. "I think Rainbow knew what he was doing that day. He helped us find something better than a way home." Mrs. Chen squeezed her daughter's hand, touched by the wisdom in those words. Sometimes it takes a child's heart to see the truth, that in helping others, we often find ourselves, and that the best adventures aren't the ones we take alone, but the ones that bring us together. The morning sun caught the dew on the new sign at the bus stop, making it sparkle like the creek spray had done that day. Below the official contact numbers, someone had added a simple message that summed up everything their community had learned. "In this neighborhood, nobody walks alone." And they never did again.